Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gleb Topersky.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Eleanor. And I really appreciate all of you coming here. I think you've made a good decision. So first lesson, decision making. Come to trainings on decision making. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. And the first thing I want to tell you is answer a question that I get asked very often. Where are you from? Now, imagine that you go to a neighborhood diner somewhere, and instead of hearing a welcome from the waitress, you hear, where are you from? Or you go to a CVS and you're checking out, and the cashier, once you say hello, asks you where are you from instead of saying hi back. How do you feel? Like, that feels kind of alienating. That feels sort of anxiety-producing. It's like, oh, you ain't from around here, are you? Imagine how you would feel with that. Well, that's kind of my story of my experience. And I decided to, way back when, to keep my accent. And the decision didn't really work out so well for me. But let me tell you a little bit about my story. So my parents immigrated from this little country over here, tiny itsy-bitsy landlocked country called Moldova. And I was 10 when that happened, and we settled in New York City. Now, my parents were pretty poor, as all immigrants are. My mother washed people's houses. My dad drove a bread truck, so we always had enough bread to eat. Fell off the back of the truck. Now, I was, like I said, poor growing up. My parents didn't have enough money for bus fare. I walked over an hour every day to school. So that was the context in which I lived. Now, New York was a cultural hodgepodge. And when I was deciding whether to keep my accent or not, I was like, well, I want to keep connected to my cultural heritage. I'll keep my accent. Now, that was New York. I didn't really realize what the rest of the country was like. Once I started living in North Carolina, and then I moved to Ohio, that's where I started getting the where are you from comments. That's when I started getting those. Now, I also, once I started doing research in behavioral science, learned that people with foreign accents tend to be trusted less than people who don't have foreign accents. So actually research showing that people perceive others with foreign accents as not part of their in-tribe. And by that time, the time I was learning it, it was already a little bit too late for me to drop my accent. It was kind of part of my public persona, and so on. Now, the only silver lining to my accent is that at least when I do TV interviews and radio interviews, I get recognized. So there's a little bit of a distinction. But that's only silver lining. That was an example of how to not make a decision. I didn't really think about the long-term consequences of my decision, what it would be like. And this is something that I want to help people avoid. It was a little bit of a minor disaster, but it was still quite a bad decision, which I would have done differently if I had time to go back and redo it again. So I want to help you and your clients avoid bad decisions by looking forward into the future and helping make sure that all of your decisions are aligned with your goals and all of your clients' decisions are aligned with your clients' goals. So let me go over what the presentation will involve. We'll have the presentation, we'll talk about takeaways, choosing some decisions that your clients might be thinking about. I'll talk about the presentation itself. I'll do the presentation, some Q&As. Then how do you avoid a disaster after a decision was made? So one is how do you avoid a decision that would lead to disaster? And the second is how do you avoid disasters once a decision is made? And then we'll do some final Q&A and tip sheets. So let's talk about the 3 key takeaways that I want you to be thinking about when you're doing your presentation. And this is all described in the handout that you have. 3 key takeaways. Our emotions are central to decision making. So this is not about being Spock, for those of you who still, who watch Star Trek. This is not about being cold, rational, and so on. Our emotions are key. They determine maybe about 80% of our decision making, and they're mostly right, but they're sometimes wrong. and they're wrong in systematic and predictable ways. And because they're systematic and predictable, they're avoidable. So we don't have to let our emotions, our gut intuitions lead us astray. We can learn when they lead us in the wrong direction, like keeping my accent. Now, we need to combine intuitive thinking and analytical thinking. Intuitive is our gut intuitions. Analytical thinking is when we bring our reason on board. And we need to learn about what our own particularities in decision-making failures are. Everyone is different. So everyone is different, and there are some certain systematic predictable patterns, but we need to learn our own cognitive biases. This is what they're called, cognitive biases, and how to avoid them. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about team decision-making. It's most effective for making best decisions, that's what the research shows, but only when we avoid certain systematic errors that are likely to creep on board. So that's the three takeaways that I want you to be thinking about and looking for as you consider this presentation. Now, I want to say that this is not going to be a lecture by a long-winded professor who will just be boring you with theory. I want to give you pragmatic and practical advice. And I don't, as any scholar, I want to provide you with evidence of this. So I'll provide you with evidence from previous people from whom I gave this presentation and whom I coached and did consulting for. So this was from an unsolicited email by Teresa Trost from a presentation I did much like this one. I will never approach decision-making the same way again. You gave me some wonderful insights on cognitive biases and how they influence our decisions. I plan to use your pre-mortem process with my team and our board. So that's in a speaking presentation. Now, this next one is by someone many of you know here.
Didn't see that coming.
Would you do the honor of reading it?
So I work for an engineering firm. We contacted Gleb to acquire some insights into how to motivate scientific people to sell themselves. The constant challenge of the business. Engineers don't like to sell. So Gleb used his research-based approach to behavioral psychology to engage us in a conversation that provided several very helpful insights into how we communicate with our engineers. We were using far too much business speak that was not connecting emotionally with our people. For example, we've stopped using the word brand and now use the word reputation, which resonates with scientists. So I have to say that one of the things Gleb said to me when I'm talking about, I'm not an engineer, have never been an engineer, but I work in human resources. And he started talking to me about emotion. My first response was, engineers have emotions? And he went on to teach me that, even engineers, scientists, although they like to think of themselves as rational animals, still, like the rest of us, are driven primarily by emotional thinking and emotional responses to language.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate you reading that. So, now I'd like you to take a minute to think about a major decision that's coming up for a client of yours, or one that came up in the past that you might be thinking about, but ideally it would be one that a client of yours is facing. Maybe your client is looking to make a hire. Maybe your client is looking for a new job. Maybe your client is thinking about which place to move to if he or she is thinking about moving. Anything that your client might be facing that they might ask you about. So I want you to take a minute to think of a decision and write it down somewhere on the handout that I provided for you. All right, I see that everyone has their pens down, so let's proceed. Now, I want to connect to what Mark was talking about emotions and reason. We think we are this guy, the brainy head puzzle piece guy. That's who we think we are. We think we're cognitive, we are rational, analytical, reasonable selves. So that's our typical intuition, even engineers. Well, what the research shows us, though, we're more like this guy. This is the rational, analytical, gray self. And this rational, analytical, gray self is riding on a huge, colorful elephant of big, beautiful emotions. Anger, frustration, fear, anxiety, joy, pleasure. All emotions. They're colorful, beautiful, powerful, like an elephant versus a rider. This is a concept first brought up by Jonathan Haidt, and he uses this metaphor. So of an elephant and a rider. Like, we can't really control the elephant very well in the moment. It's very easy for an elephant to stampede and overwhelm us. So emotions are going to be much more powerful in the moment than our reason, than our intellect. But in the long term, the rider can control the elephant, can manage the elephant, can direct the elephant to where the rider needs the elephant to go. So this connects to the two systems of thinking that we have. One is called system 1, or the autopilot system. So the autopilot system, that's the elephant system. That's the much more intuitive one. It's very powerful. It's the one that gives us the flight or fight response. So it's the one that evolved in the savannah for us to survive. When a saber-toothed tiger would come, heard of the saber-toothed tiger response, the fight response? Or when there's a snake crawling, you want to freeze, so that's part of the flight response. So it's very fundamental for our survival. It turns out in milliseconds. It's very easy. It's very intuitive. It feels very comfortable. That's where you get your gut feelings. That feels right. Now our other system, that's the system 2. That's the rider. That's the intentional system. And this is the system that actually evolved to help us survive in groups. So it evolved when we began to live in tribes, and it's much more effortful. It takes work and hard effort to turn on. Now, if the autopilot system turns on in milliseconds, this system takes about a second to turn on. So it's a couple of 100 times slower than the autopilot system, your gut intuitions. It doesn't feel right. Your feeling, your gut intuitions, that's not your intentional system. This system is slow, reasoning, and logical. It's the math system. Now, for a coaching example, imagine that you have a client who's going to talk to his boss about some problematic evaluation, annual review, and the client knows it's not going well. Now, that depending on the client, if the client hears negative news about their performance evaluation from the boss, the autopilot system wants to either, stick the fingers in the air and go, la, 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 I can't hear you. That's the flight response. That's the flight response. Now, the other response is the that's the fight response. So it depends on what kind of client you have. You have an aggressive client, you get the fight response. You have the, more down-to-earth, calm client, you're likely to get the flight response. Now, the intentional system, the right response, is to incorporate the feedback of the boss into the performance of the employee and then improve based on that feedback. It doesn't feel right to our guts. That's not the intuitive response. That's not what we want to do. So we want to do the wrong thing in that case. It's always going to be a trained response to incorporate the feedback into one's performance and improve in the future. So we have to go against our gut, against our intuitions. This is a time when the predictable errors, when we don't want to go in that direction. So what you need to do is retrain the mind. In these sorts of situations, you need to retrain the mind. You need to be an elephant whisperer. You need to strategically train your elephant, your autopilot system, to go in an intentional direction where you want it to go. And you need to prepare for your emotional responses. I would not send my coaching client to a meeting with his boss unprepared. I would talk him through it. I would role play. I would do some strategic preparation. I'd have him calm himself down beforehand using various mechanisms and plan ahead for his emotions. How many of you have planned ahead for the client's emotions? Raise your hand if you do. Good. I'm glad you do. The rest of you should. Planning ahead for the client's emotions is super important in being able to be a good coach and help your client avoid disastrous decisions. Now, take a look at this picture. How many of you see an older woman? Raise your hand. How many of you see a younger woman? Raise your hand. Cool. Good. So why do some of you see an older woman and why do some of you see a younger woman? Does anyone know?
Perception.
Okay, do you want to share about this, Eleanor?
Well, when I first initially looked at it, it looked like an older woman.
Mm-hmm.
But then I looked at it again, and she looked like a younger woman.
Right. Well, she's kind of both. And here you see the picture with two highlighted images. This is one where she looks more like a younger woman. This is one where she looks more like an older woman. So it is about perception. Is the glass half empty or half full? Those of us who tend to be more pessimistic will tend to see an older woman. Those of us who tend to be more optimistic will tend to see a younger woman. Now, this is really important. This is two basic fundamental differences in people, whether they're more optimistically inclined or more pessimistically inclined. And this comes out in really fundamentally important ways in coaching and consulting and all sorts of human resources, working with people. I'll give you an example from my own experience. So my wife and I, so lovely Agnes, I'd like you to give her a hand. Now, we started Intentional Insights, a nonprofit that we both run, in 2014. We got married in 2003. And you know what? We never had as many fights as we did in 2014 in our marriage. Never. We had so many strains and conflicts. Well, this was because she's more pessimistic and I'm more optimistic. So I'm more risk blind, and she's more risk everywhere. So, I tend to think of, oh, everything will be great, everything will be fine. The grass is always green on the other side. And she tends to think that, the grass is always yellow on the other side. And this is true, she knows this. So we had a lot of conflicts about how to plan ahead, how long the nonprofit will tend to get going, how much people will be enthusiastic about it. Now, there's no right answer of whether she's right or I'm right, on risky situations. The best perspective is to be realistic optimists and realistic pessimists. And so we worked out a system where, I proposed a whole bunch of half-baked ideas, and now she knows that before when I say it, they're half-baked. They're not she would never say give half-baked ideas. It would need to take her a lot of time to really fully bake the idea before she gives it. And I just spout a lot of half-baked ideas, and then she bakes them. Or she she says which ones are bad, and you shouldn't pursue them. I'm like, okay, I won't feel bad about her saying that they're bad, and she doesn't get so anxious about the ideas I give her because now she knows that they're okay, they're just propositions. So we learned to work together and collaborate together because we learned this about each other. And how many of you would have had clients who make unrealistically ambitious and optimistic plans? Raise your hand if you have those clients. And how many of you have clients whose confidence you needed to build up and who you saw that they weren't reaching their full potential? Raise your hands. Right. So the first ones that, of course, tend to be optimistic, and the latter ones tend to be pessimistic. And both of those are just personality traits, tendencies, what the scholarship calls cognitive biases, that cause both of them to go astray. The first will make big mistakes, costly mistakes, because of their optimism. And you need to use strategic questioning and coaching to make them realize this. While for the second, it's really important to talk to them and build up their confidence and show them that, they systematically tend to underestimate themselves and give them evidence of how and when they underestimate themselves. So let's talk about these cognitive biases. Now, if you're curious to learn more about them, I suggest going to Wikipedia. I don't often recommend Wikipedia, but in this case I do. It's a good resource. There are a number of good scholars working on that specific article. Look at the list of cognitive biases. You'll see there's over 100 listed there. And there are more being added, every week. Because this is a brand new research field. Not brand new, but there are new ones being discovered every week and every month and so on. And so scholars are adding more and more cognitive biases to these things. Ones that we've already known about, like pessimism and optimism bias, but there are other ones coming up. So if this was a half-day workshop or a full-day workshop, I talk about a number of them. I only have time to go in depth into a couple, like pessimism and optimism. I'll give a few more. But each of these is something that can trip up your client and cause her or him to make a disastrous decision. So if you want to learn more about these, go to the list of cognitive biases in Wikipedia and look them up. And we need to figure out how to help our clients avoid these. So for example, the overconfidence effect. Now, that's a really prominent one. And overconfidence works both ways. It doesn't mean it feeds into pessimism and optimism, but it doesn't only make optimists more optimistic. It makes pessimists more pessimistic. So that's a really dangerous thing, that people are overconfident. Now, when people say that they're 99% sure about an answer, how often do you think, what percentage of the time do you think they're actually right? 80%. 80% of the time. If you put money on that, this is how casinos make their money. I'm 99% sure it will land on red. Oops. That's a bad thing. About 90% of people consider themselves above average drivers. Why do we have so many road fatalities here in the United States? Overconfidence is a huge, huge problem in our industries and in our lives. I'll give an example of a coaching client. I don't do too much coaching. I mostly do coaching in the context of consulting. I mainly do consulting. But there was a consulting client, a nonprofit for which I did consulting, and I did coaching as part of that for their executive director. So the executive director, it's a mid-sized nonprofit, and he had a lot of trouble with the board who were pushing back on him in pretty aggressive ways. And so he was getting a lot of anxiety and frustration around this, and he was sort of getting burned out. And I was encouraging him really strongly to go to the board and tell them about his emotions and how he was feeling. Now, I'm a strong advocate for mental illness. He was experiencing anxiety. I myself have a mental illness. I go to a therapist weekly. I take prescription medication to address anxiety disorder. So that's something I experienced, and I'm pretty open about it. I was strongly encouraging him to be open about it. But he really didn't want to. He was afraid that the board would just gang up on him and jump on him and fire him on the spot. He literally told me this. I was like, you're being really pessimistic. And remember, you're being a pessimist and you're being overconfident about your pessimism. Well, he went to the board. He told them about the situation when he couldn't stand it anymore. And they were actually very supportive. They were like, yes, wow, we had no idea we had this impact. Of course we'll help you. Of course we'll provide you with the support you need. But, it was a little bit too late. He was already pretty burned out, and he quit in a few months. He resigned, and they're conducting an executive director search, which is a pretty costly thing for the nonprofit, and pretty costly for him. Like, he's having trouble figuring out the next stage in his life, but he just couldn't stand it anymore. And that came because of a combination of pessimism and overconfidence. So how do you think, I want you to think about how would you address this overconfidence, whether in pessimism or in optimism, in your clients, knowing that this is something that tends to happen for clients. Now, empathy gap. Empathy gap is a pretty huge one. It's when we underestimate the strength of intensity of emotions in others. So Mark gave an example of the underestimating the strength of intensity in engineers with whom he works. So this is actually a common consulting thing that I do with people who are more technically oriented. So there's a software firm in San Francisco with whom I worked, and they actually had a quite similar experience in that computer programmers there were asked to do better client service. So it wasn't so much about marketing, it was about client service. Now, computer programmers, as you can imagine, aren't super enthusiastic about working with clients. They much prefer, working with code. That's their favorite thing to do. They want to solve problems, they want to work with code, they don't want to work with clients. So that was a problem for them. And the HR there, they also were surprised to hear the computer programmers had emotions because they don't show emotions. Computer programmers usually kind of, have this, withdrawn expression, sort of introverted. And computer programmers are strongly emotionally motivated. So what I did with them is I worked with the computer programmers, found out what motivated them, and some of the things that typically motivate people who are introverted and have more technical skills is reputation among their peers, among people like them. And they want to be liked by people whom they respect, who are other computer programmers or engineers in Mark's case. So we changed the performance management system within the software company to be team-based and project-based. So each project, each piece of software that the company ran got a separate team of people around it. And those people were evaluated based on their customer satisfaction associated with that piece of software. So each team's bonus was strongly associated with customer satisfaction. And people within those teams started putting appropriate peer pressure on each other to make sure that each of the engineers satisfied customer requirements. And when one of the engineers was slacking off, he, or more rarely she, it was mostly white males, as you can imagine, with engineers, computer programmers, got pressure, got some negative words from their fellow engineers about like, hey, well, because of you, the customer is giving us negative reputation points and we're losing bonus salaries. That was what was really needed. Now, over time, next year after this intervention, the involvement of programmers in client calls and their engagement with clients by internal metrics increased by about 60%, and client satisfaction increased by about 30%, something like that. So that was exactly what was needed because they were now emotionally motivated. They cared in the moment. Their autopilot system knew, it was instinctive, oh, I'm not going to satisfy this customer, I'm not going to spend the appropriate time. My friends here, the people who I respect, other software programmers, will criticize me. They don't want that. So you got to change the incentives in such a way as to motivate their emotions, even people who you may not think have emotions. So that's where empathy gap comes in. The underestimating the strength of feeling among other people. Now, where do you think your coaching clients might suffer from empathy gaps, underestimating the strength of feeling in those they work with? Are they underestimating the strength of feelings with their boss, let's say, or with their coworkers, or maybe in their personal lives with their family, with their wives or husbands or something like that? Where might they be underestimating the status quo bias? Now, that's a big one. That's a desire to stay where we are and not change. Now, the reason that happens is because the autopilot system in the savannah was very short-term oriented. It wants what it wants right now, because that's what survival is about. You know, you have that second piece of chocolate cake, you're gonna eat that second piece of chocolate cake, says the autopilot system. You know, the boss is criticizing you, you better run away or you better punch the boss in the face. So this short-term orientation leads to status quo bias. We want to stay where we are. We don't want to change, even if the change is good for us. That's the essence of status quo bias. Now, I know that as coaches, you know, all of us work to help our clients change. Now, I want you to think about ways that you have overcome status quo bias in your clients. I just want a couple of examples. What are ways that you work to overcome status quo bias?
I do a lot of tapping into their why, you know, the outcome of change and why they might want to.
Nice. That's great.
And to balance that, is to ask, or to probe into their level of satisfaction things are. Because usually they're not coming to you to even work with you. They're satisfied
Yeah.
with where they're at.
Excellent. Yeah, so that's a really good technique. So whether they're not satisfied where they're at and why they want to do it. I think a third thing I would add is getting them to think about how happy they will be, how pleased they will be when they will change, when they will shift. So you want to appeal to emotions. Here again, the crucial thing is to appeal to emotions. The why appeals to the intellect well, kind of why you're not satisfied right now appeals to negative emotions well. You also want to appeal to positive emotions. You know, how happy will you be when you change?
So it's starting to dig into their aspirations of where they want to be, which then, if they're talking about aspirations or looking to the future, that should help their emotions get excited to move them in that direction.
Sort of, but the other way around. More like how happy they will be in the future, and then connecting into the things they need to do right now. The difficult things they need to do right now, motivate that by happiness in the future. So what Mark talked about is, you know, frustration, negative feelings around the current situation. Then you want happiness in the future, and that will help motivate them to move toward that happiness in the future.
One thing I do, specifically with avoidance tendencies, I explain to them that avoidance can be physiologically reinforcing in the sense that if I'm anxious about something, I'm going to go talk to my boss, I turn around and walk away, all my anxiety goes temporarily. So we talk a little bit about that and then how to reprogram the brain through cognitive types of things. Because really, I think with the way the brain is now, the research and everything, we develop channels, pathways, so it's an automatic response.
Yep.
And also to get them to recognize it's comfortable and familiar to do that, but not necessarily good for you.
That's excellent, yes. So you want to change the mental habits that are unhelpful.
Yeah, and you really need to be extremely intentional about it and do it regularly, every day, every hour, just to kind of reprogram that brain. And also develop things where it teaches them to relax and just journaling too, I think helps.
Yeah, so it's kind of going deeper, but yes, reprogramming the brain, that's essentially retraining the elephant. That's essentially getting the intentional system going and retraining the autopilot system. So what you're doing in that case is helping break them out of a negative cycle. What I like to do is, you know, talk to people in more concrete ways that helps them realize, you know, if you have a aching tooth, it hurts to go to the dentist. You know, more than the ache of the tooth would hurt to keep aching it, you know, in every moment. But in the long term, you're just going to get way more pain if you let your teeth rot. So people can resonate with this sort of stuff that's like kind of visceral and familiar, and they find it harder to resonate with things about their brain. Oh, my brain will hurt? It's like, so making it physical and concrete is a good strategy for that.
Yeah, sometimes if you're dealing with relationships and they need to break up with that person, oh, but I love them. And I give the example, well, you love strawberries, but you're extremely allergic to them. You're going to keep eating them.
That's right.
So, yeah, I think that it's good to put that in their mind too.
Absolutely. That's really good. Good. Now, dealing with cognitive biases. don't have time to go into a deep thing right now about how to deal with them. If I was giving a full day or a half day workshop, I'd go into a number of strategies. But the easiest thing to do, the quickest thing to do, is to put a number on it. Put a number on the estimate of, let's say, with your negativity. If you have negative emotions around something, how bad is that on a scale of 1 to 10? And how happy would you be with a different situation on a scale of 1 to 10? And then how painful would it be to change? And by talking about numbers, you can start getting people to be more fixed. The autopilot system doesn't like numbers. It really wants just vague feelings and intuitions and gut reactions. You want to get numbers that's the more intentional system. So getting them to be more intentional by putting numbers on their emotional experiences is going to be a really quick fix for a lot of these cognitive biases. For someone who is pessimistic, how bad do you think that will be? Will the boss really be as nasty as you think she will? And then rate the nastiness before and after, and so on. So making predictions and putting numbers on it is going to be really important to help your clients avoid disastrous decisions. Now, I've developed a web app, which is, I'm not going to go into here because we don't have time, but it's going to be on your sheet, which you can access by typing in that code, and that will help you put numbers in such a way as to avoid disastrous decisions. So that helps you make a call on any significant decision. It's unfortunate that Barb Gerson isn't here because she was testing it out and kind of was going to share about some of her experiences with it, but whatever. So just check it out, and that will help you help your clients make choices about various decisions by putting numbers on them. All right, so we have a little bit of time for Q&A. So I'm not finished yet. We'll still have another session of how do you avoid disastrous decisions when you actually made a decision. But right now, I want to hear questions and clarification about any aspects of cognitive biases, the intentional system, and the autopilot system, and all that.
Could you kind of walk us through what you would do with a client in terms of put a number on it?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say your client is very pessimistic
Mm-hmm.
about the outcome of the meeting.
Sure.
And you would say, put a number on it, and
Mm-hmm.
this 1 to 10 or something?
Yes. So
And they say, it's an 8.
Great.
Where would you go?
Sure. Perfect. So let's say you have a client and you say, the worse it, let's say you say the worse it is, the lower the number. The better it is, the higher number, for example. And how bad do you think the meeting will be? And let's say they put, they'll say it's going to be a 2. Then they go to the meeting and you meet with them afterward and you say, well, how bad was it actually? And they're like, okay, I was overconfident, it's actually a 4. Over time, you let them calibrate. That lets them calibrate and see that their gut reactions are going to be excessively pessimistic or excessively optimistic if the client thinks it's going to be an 8 and then turned out to be a 6. And that can be done with any sort of decision. How good do you think this hire will be for your company? Or something like that.
So if your client is someone who journals,
Mm-hmm.
this might be
Yes.
a place you could park those
Mm-hmm.
observations and
Yep.
trends.
That's one place to park it. Another is just during each coaching session, have the client estimate how the several things that they anticipate will happen this week and how bad they will be, and rate them on that scale or how good they will be. And then in your coaching session next week or in 2 weeks, how bad were they, or how good were they? And so that way you get them to actually recalibrate themselves. What Bob was talking about, putting new pathways in. So that's a way for them to put in new pathways and recalibrate their intuitions.
Thanks.
Sure, you're welcome. So let's talk about ways of avoiding disasters once you make a decision. Now, prevention is going to be crucial. Ben Franklin said quite wise thing, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it really is. Preventing disasters, once you make a decision, is much easier than dealing with crises. Now, when I talk about this to CEOs, there's some like skepticism among CEOs because they say, well, resolving crises is what I'm best at, managing crises. And I hear that, and there's unfortunately some systemic rewards in companies that doesn't align CEO pay with the benefits of the company. Because CEOs who go and who are turnaround CEOs or who step in the middle of a crisis and who fix things up, they're seen as the heroes, they're seen as the saviors, they get the big bucks. But what happens to the CEOs who prevent the crisis in the first place? They don't have that glory. They don't have that big pay. But they're much better for the organization because the crisis didn't happen. So this is one of those situations where our capitalistic system is misaligned, where because of our perceptions, we're not actually paying people what they're worth. So just something to note and understand, what do you want to do? So as a coach, you can be glorious in the moment by helping your client out of a disaster or help your client avoid a disaster in the first place. And we have an ethical responsibility as coaches to do the best thing for our clients. Even though it might make us look best to help our client out of a disaster, it would be much better for our client to help that client avoid the disaster in the first place. So let's talk about a way to do that, called the pre-mortem. So the post-mortem process, learning from our mistakes. We had something happen, our client, a client made a decision to hire someone, and that hire didn't work out. And bad, what can you learn from it? Well, don't hire a person with these characteristics again. Or, don't go to, or if a client took a job, don't go to that sort of job again, or something like that. That's the post-mortem. Pre-mortem is where you predict in advance what can go wrong with a certain decision, write out scenarios for how it might go wrong, and prevent the kind of problems that you anticipate in advance. So let's talk about the ways that you would do it. Now, this can be done with a team or by an individual. So I'm going to talk through how an individual would do it, but this can be, I would say it's even more effective with a team, which is part of the key takeaway about team decision making. So first, you get stakeholders in a meeting. You ensure a mix of people with expertise on the topic and authority to make decisions. Now, if you're an individual, if you're working with an individual, which most of us as coaches are, you want to write out various roles. So I was working with an executive director of a large nonprofit who was thinking about moving on from his job to a new job. So he was thinking about, well, what kind of internal drivers do I have? And that's what you would want to write about, a mix of roles. So he had internal drivers to ensure the success of his current nonprofit, where he worked at, a drive to improve the world, make the world a better place, a drive to ensure mental well-being and security and physical well-being and security for himself, and good financial security. Those were his drivers. Now, a team might have, let's say you're working on performance management change. You want someone who's like a CFO, a CEO, HR VP, or something like that. You'd want a couple of people who actually are going to be directly impacted by the process. So diverse people from various sectors in the organization who would have more of the expertise and authority on how it would impact individuals. So that would be, the difference in how you'd approach it from an individual perspective or from a team perspective. The second is explaining the steps, describe the steps. So then you ask all to imagine a future where the project definitely failed. Things totally went haywire. And then think about the reasons why it failed. Why did the project fail? Now, if you have a team, you want them to write these out anonymously, That way you won't get into groupthink. Groupthink is a problem where people with authority in the room dominate everyone else's decision making. A great way to avoid this is by having people write down things anonymously. That way you don't know if it's coming from the CEO or if it's coming from the clerk somewhere else, who's involved in the process. And that way everyone's decisions are going to be considered. So if you have, it's best to hire an outside facilitator for this. So this is your opportunity as a coach. If you're coaching with the organization as the 40-40 organization, you can come into an organization and coach a team meeting around this. Or if you're working with the individual, let's say the executive director, so that's not an opportunity to write anonymously, but that's still, try to keep those roles and drivers separate. So asking them to write out reasons anonymously, and as a facilitator, you gather written comments and read them aloud. You especially want to encourage reasons that might be seen as rude or unpopular, because those are things that would not have come out typically in a groupthink situation. So for the executive director, he had reasons such as that the nonprofit that he's leaving might fail because he's not leading it anymore. He had reasons like that he didn't have digital savvy for the new positions that he would be applying for. And the third reason was that he didn't have he would fail because he's going to a new position where he is unused to being. He was the executive director, the founder of the nonprofit that he ran for over 20 years. So he didn't know how to be the executive director who wasn't also co-founder, who also wasn't the founder of the nonprofit. Then step 4. Yes.
Say a little bit more about what you mean by rude.
Sure. So I was working with a member-based nonprofit in San Francisco, and which was doing a fundraising campaign, big fundraising campaign. And there was a board member who was leading the peer-to-peer fundraising committee. And one of the reasons that came up was that the board member is sort of leading a faction in the member-based nonprofit that was opposed to another faction in the member-based nonprofit. And because the board member is leading that nonprofit, people from the other faction wouldn't be willing to donate money to the fundraising campaign. So that's something that didn't come up previously in the conversations. And as a result of that coming up, it was there was this particular effort to reach out to people who are leading the other faction to get them engaged with the fundraising campaign. Kind of like, well, you opposed me in the factionalism thing, but we still want the nonprofit to buy the building. It was a capital fundraising campaign, so we still need to raise the $4 million and that. Other things I had in my consulting was that the CEO of the company is too new to launch this new project, and he doesn't have enough relationships in the corporation to really change things around, and he's perceived as like changing things too quickly and too fast. So maybe spend more time on getting to know people. So these are things that people typically wouldn't want to hear, and would be perceived as too rude, socially improper to mention. So, and that comes again down from the emotions. These aren't rational things. They're emotional things. Technically, it shouldn't matter that there's factionalism in the nonprofit, member-based nonprofit, and they should all pull together for the benefit of buying the new building. But really, emotions are going to come into play. It shouldn't matter that the CEO is new. If the project is still good, if the change is still good, it shouldn't matter. But really, it does matter. People's emotions, this is how people feel about it. So that's the key. That's what rude things are.
Would another word for rude be offensive?
Yeah, absolutely. Rude, offensive, impolitic might be another one. So like something that goes against internal politics, or something that would be perceived as like harmful to somebody's career or somebody's relationships in the organization. Sure. Now, step 4. You want to discuss all the reasons that are brought up, but particularly ones that are rude, unpopular, dangerous to careers, and estimate the probability for each reason for failure anonymously if you're part of a team. So anonymous evaluation, or not anonymously if you're doing individually. So with the nonprofit leader that I was talking about who wanted a new job, he estimated that the danger of the nonprofit failing was 40%. The danger of digital skills, him failing due to lack of digital skills, was 30%, and him failing due to him not knowing how to be an executive director without also being a founder was something like 70%. So that's the estimates of the probabilities for failure. Next, decide on several failures that are most relevant and brainstorm ways of preventing them from occurring. So I worked with this executive director of the nonprofit. I kind of thought that his first one, it was due to his pessimism. So he was someone who was pessimistic. I talked to him about it, and we decided that the actual probability is something closer to 5% of the nonprofit failing due to him leaving. So he said that he was comfortable with that. We let it go. For the second one, for digital skills, he took some classes at a local community college to address that. And for the third one, he got a mentor from a nonprofit professional organization who was an executive director of several nonprofits, who helped him get trained in being an executive director without being a founder as well. So in 3 months, again, we did the pre-mortem, and it went fine, and he looked for a job, and in 4 months, he found a really good position that he still enjoys working there. And for a team, you'd want to do the same things, brainstorming solutions, and figuring out how to apply those in a practical manner. So I mentioned with the member-based nonprofit, we reached out to the other faction. That was one way of doing it. With the CEO, who was inexperienced, we decided to delay the change that was going to happen in the organization for 3 months, while the CEO was really focused on building up relationships with internal stakeholders and getting them more on board with his leadership and kind of getting them to trust. And that worked out fine as well. So questions and answers about this Q&A?
So when you do this in a group, and you ask people to estimate the probability for each reason for failure,
yes.
Do you aggregate those?
Yes, you aggregate those. So for example, the board member who was leading the team, the peer evaluation team, the fundraising committee, he didn't think it was going to be highly likely that this failed because of his leadership, but other people did. And then you average out those scores, and you use that to estimate what you will focus on, the several failures that are most relevant. Other questions on this? So I want you to take a couple of minutes right now to discuss around your tables about how you might think to use the pre-mortem process with your own clients. So take a couple of minutes. I'll circle around. Agnes will circle around. We can answer questions. So take a couple of minutes to think about this. All right, folks. So it's about time to wrap up. And I hope your conversations have been really helpful. And I encourage you to continue these conversations after the session, but our time is limited. So let's get to the final stage of the presentation. Now, something that Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel Prize winner for this stuff, researching the decision-making, does is he challenges companies that he consults for to invest at least 5% of their resources into decision-making improvement. And I'm going to get you to consider that. I'm going to get you to consider investing at least 1% of your resources. And don't go for 5, but start with 1% of your resources. Invest it in improving your decision-making and the decision-making of your clients. This is an area on the cutting edge of the scholarship of how the human mind works. This is not about pulling teeth, as we said. We're used to dentists. We're not used to doing what Bob talked about, changing our mental habits. But our mind is so much more important than our mouth, at least for most of us. It's so much more important to change how we think, to make better decisions, to avoid disasters. So I'll challenge you to invest at least 1% of your resources into decision making and improving the decision making of your clients, yourselves, your companies, anyone you're associated with. And that can mean getting training, so time resources, investing the resources of your staff, of yourselves, of your clients, giving them stuff to read, working with them on various exercises, anything that you can do to invest 1% of your resources. So think about everything that you do to invest 1% of your resources into making better decisions to avoid disasters for yourself and your clients. Thank you. Really appreciate your attention, and this is an opportunity for you to show your appreciation and then ask any questions.